In 1347, Genoese merchant ships pulled into port at Sicily, carrying cargo, crew, and something no one could see. Sailors were found dead or dying at their oars. Within 4 years, somewhere between a third and half of Europe was gone. Doctors had no cure. Priests had no explanation. Kings had no defense. Nobody understood what was killing them, and that ignorance was just as deadly as the disease itself. The ships that fled Sicily didn't know they were carrying anything. That's the part that should unsettle you. Because what was on board wasn't a sick sailor you could quarantine, or a contaminated crate you could throw overboard. It was something far smaller, far older, and far more patient than any of that. The killer was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lived inside fleas. The fleas lived on rats, and the rats were everywhere, in the grain holds, in the rope coils, in the walls of every port city in the Mediterranean. The entire chain of transmission, from rat to flea to human, was completely invisible to every person it was about to destroy. You couldn't see it. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't reason your way to it. It was simply there. This thing didn't start in Sicily. It started far to the east, somewhere in Central Asia, and by the time it reached Europe, it had already been killing for years. In 1347, Mongol forces under the Kipchak Khan Jani Beg were besieging a Genoese trading port called Kaffa in Crimea. The plague was tearing through the army. The forces were disintegrating. So Jani Beg did something that, even by the standards of medieval warfare, was extraordinary. His forces used trebuchets to catapult plague-infected corpses over the city walls, to demoralize the enemy and to infect them. It is, by most accounts, one of the earliest documented acts of biological warfare in recorded history. And it worked. The Genoese merchants inside Kaffa fled by sea, carrying the disease with them, and that is how it reached Sicily that same year. From there, the spread was almost mechanical in its brutality. Mainland Italy and France by 1348. England by August of that same year, a single ship from Calais landing at Dorset, and within months the disease had reached Bristol. London was devastated between February and May of 1349. By 1350, it had reached Scandinavia. The entire continent, consumed in under 3 years. The speed of it was the horror. No explanation could keep up with it. And so the people living through this, watching their neighbors die, watching their priests die, watching their kings die, were left to ask the only question that mattered: what is doing this to us? None of the people living through this were fools. That matters. Because it is very easy, from where we stand, to look back and say they got everything wrong. But they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have germ theory, they didn't even have the concept of an organism too small to see. What they had was observation, theology, and the best reasoning their world could produce. And every single framework they built to explain the dying was internally coherent. It was just catastrophically pointed in the wrong direction. The first explanation was the most deeply held. If God governs everything, and in medieval Europe, this was not a fringe belief, it was the operating assumption of the entire civilization, then mass death on this scale could only mean one thing: mass sin. The logic is airtight if you accept the premise. A God who controls the world does not allow a third of his creation to die without reason. Therefore, the reason must be moral. Therefore, the answer must be repentance. This was not superstition. This was systematic theology applied to a crisis. The second framework was almost scientific by the standards of the era. Miasma theory held that rotting matter, animal waste, decomposing bodies, stagnant water released an invisible poison into the air. That poison entered the body through sweat and opened pores and corrupted the blood from the inside. Now the uncomfortable part: that inference is not crazy, Disease does cluster around filth. Plague did devastate towns more than the countryside, where the danger of contagion was genuinely greater and waste was everywhere. The mechanism was wrong, but the observation underneath it was real. The third explanation wove together astrology and medicine. Planetary alignments, it was argued, could corrupt the air itself, and certain bodies, those whose four humours were already out of balance, would be most susceptible when the air turned. Yellow bile, black bile, blood, phlegm. If these fluids were not in equilibrium, the body had no defense. This was not folk wisdom whispered in market squares. This was the formal medical consensus of the era's universities. 3 frameworks, 3 different answers to the same unbearable question. Each one produced a specific, coherent response. The responses were sometimes harmless. Sometimes they were actively making things worse. And that is where this story gets truly dark. Of those 3 frameworks, divine punishment, miasma, imbalanced humours, which one do you think you would have believed if you'd lived through it? Drop your answer in the comments below, because the responses each framework produced ranged from harmless to genuinely catastrophic, and that's exactly where we're going next. Even running away didn't work. It just spread the disease faster. Think about what that means. The people who had the means to flee, the wealthy merchants, the landowners, the nobles, loaded up their carts and left the cities the moment the dying started. They were following the miasma logic perfectly. Get away from the filth, find clean air, survive. And they took the infected fleas with them. Every road out of a plague city was a new route for the disease to travel. Every country estate that took in a fleeing family from Florence or Paris became a new outbreak point. The cure was the vector. And this pattern played out at every level of society. Priests who believed the dying bodies were releasing miasma abandoned their parishes rather than administer last rites, which meant the sick died without confession, which, in the theological framework of the era, meant dying in sin. The very people whose job was to offer comfort in death were fleeing the dying. Those who stayed and prayed, who gathered in churches, who joined candlelit processions, who confessed publicly and burned offerings, were packing themselves into enclosed spaces with infected neighbors, doing exactly what would accelerate transmission. Then there were the flagellants, groups of men moving in procession through town squares across northern Europe, whipping their own bare backs, believing that visible suffering would satisfy God's anger and stop the dying. It didn't, but it did move people and their fleas from town to town in organized, well-attended public events. The humoral response was arguably the most directly lethal. Bloodletting and purging, deliberately draining blood from patients whose bodies were already shutting down, deliberately weakening people who had no reserves left. Doctors applying chamomile lotion to the swollen lymph nodes called buboes, placing live chickens and toads on the swellings to draw out the poison. Every treatment rooted in a coherent theory, every treatment making things worse, and none of it respected rank. Eleanor, Queen of Peter IV of Aragon, died. King Alfonso V of Castile died. Joan, daughter of the English King Edward III, died en route to her wedding with Alfonso's son. The wealthiest, the most powerful, the most capable of running, none of it was enough. The authorities watched all of this unfold, and they did respond. What they came up with was almost painful to read. In April of 1349, Edward III, the King of England, the most powerful man in the country, wrote to the mayor of London. His instruction: clean the streets. That was the full weight of royal authority, deployed against a bacterium, He also ordered bishops to organize prayer parades through England's cities, public processions of priests meant to display collective repentance and confess the nation's sins before God. These were not cynical gestures. They were the logical outputs of the best explanations available. They just did nothing. Some local governments tried harder. Gloucester attempted to seal itself off entirely, closing its borders, refusing entry to travelers from infected regions. It failed, because by the time you know a city is infected, the disease is already somewhere else. And then there was the church itself. Canterbury lost two successive archbishops, John de Stratford and Thomas Bradwardine, in rapid succession. The papal court at Avignon, the administrative heart of Western Christianity, lost 1 in 4 of its members. The monastic communities, the people running the hospitals, copying the manuscripts, teaching the schools, died at higher rates than almost any other group, precisely because they were the ones caring for the sick. The institutions that existed to explain suffering and cure it were being consumed by the very crisis they were supposed to address. Their visible failure didn't go unnoticed. When the priests died alongside the sinners, when the physicians died alongside the patients, the frameworks those institutions had provided began to crack. The cultural world was collapsing alongside the biological one. Petrarch, the poet, lost Laura, the woman who inspired some of the most celebrated verse of the era, and his patron, Giovanni Cardinal Colonna, in the same wave of death. But here's what medieval Europe could not have known, and what makes this story genuinely haunting rather than merely tragic. The plague didn't stop in 1351. It came back. 1361, 1369, 1374, 1390, 1400. A drumbeat of return across 5 decades. And each time it arrived, the explanations were just as wrong as they had been the first time. In 2011, scientists published a paper in the journal Nature that finally answered the question medieval Europe had been dying over for more than half a century. They had reconstructed the genome of Yersinia pestis, the actual bacterium, from DNA recovered from the teeth of victims believed to have died from the plague. Not theorized, not inferred from symptoms. Extracted from the dead themselves, sequenced and confirmed. The transmission chain was this. The bacterium lived inside fleas. The fleas fed on black rats. When the rats died in large enough numbers, the fleas jumped to the nearest available warm body, which was human. The bacteria entered the bloodstream directly through the bite. There was no miasma. There was no divine signal readable in the dying. There was a flea, that was it. And then the climate research landed, and the story got even darker. Modern studies of the recurrences, those drumbeat returns across 5 decades, suggest the plague was reintroduced into Europe multiple times along trade routes from Central Asia. Not randomly, ecologically. Climate fluctuations caused rodent population booms in the steppe regions where the bacterium was endemic. More rodents meant more infected fleas. More infected fleas meant the disease moved along the trade routes again, finding fresh populations. The recurrences weren't bad luck. They were almost predictable if you understood the mechanism. Nobody did, which brings you back to the responses. Avoiding hot baths, the miasma logic, keep the pores closed, kept fleas on skin longer. Fleeing the cities carried infected fleas into new populations. Gathering in churches to pray packed susceptible people into enclosed spaces. The logic of miasma kept people near the very filth that harbored the rats, because if the smell was the danger, cleaning the filth was the cure, not avoiding the animals living inside it. Every framework pointed away from the one thing that would have helped, understanding what the rats were carrying. The Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe. The bacterium did that. But the second killer, the one that ensured no response could work, that every intervention either failed or accelerated the dying, was the absence of a correct explanation. And here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. That absence wasn't stupidity. It wasn't ignorance in the dismissive sense. It was the hard ceiling of available knowledge. The people who died, the people who fled, the people who bled their patients and prayed in processions and whipped themselves through town squares. They were reasoning as well as any human being can reason with the tools they had. The tools were simply wrong. And in a crisis that moved faster than any explanation could, being wrong was fatal. That is not a medieval problem. That is a human one. Subscribe if this kind of hidden history is what you're here for, and the next video goes somewhere even darker.